Eleanor Whitaker slammed $3 down on Charles Whitmore's table so hard the coins bounced, and every person standing in that ruined orchard went dead silent. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to be anything at all anymore. 2 years a widow. 36 years old. A woman too big, too quiet, and too stubborn to know when she was already beaten. And she had just spent every cent she had left on peaches that weren't fit to feed a hog. Before this story goes any further, if you're watching from somewhere out there in America, drop your city name in the comments right now. I want to know how far Eleanor's story has traveled. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, hit that button and follow along, because what this woman built from $3 and a pile of storm-ruined fruit is going to stay with you long after this video ends. Now, let's go back to that orchard. The hailstorm came on a Tuesday. It didn't announce itself. It didn't build slow the way a proper thunderstorm does, giving farmers time to cover their crop rows or pull their children inside. It fell out of a blue afternoon sky, like God had upended a bucket of gravel over Willow Creek, Colorado. And by the time anyone knew what was happening, the peach orchards on the eastern edge of town had been stripped raw. You could hear it from half a mile away, that sound. A roar, like nothing natural. Like the sky itself had decided to come down hard on everything men had built and tended and prayed over. Eleanor heard it from her kitchen window. She stood at the basin, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, washing the morning dishes, and the sound hit her before the storm did. A low percussion that shook the glass in its frame. She dried her hands on her apron and walked to the front porch, and she stood there watching the sky turn the color of a bad bruise over the ridge, and she knew. She didn't run. She didn't panic. She pressed her lips together the way she always did when something awful was coming that she couldn't stop. And she walked back inside and sat down at the kitchen table and waited for it to pass. The storm lasted 11 minutes. In 11 minutes, it unmade what 300 families had spent months building. When Eleanor walked out afterward, the air smelled of green wood and something sweet and ruined the way cut fruit smells when it's left in the sun too long. The yard was carpeted with shredded leaves and splintered branch tips. The small kitchen garden she'd been coaxing along all summer was flat to the ground, every stem bent and broken. She stood there for a long moment, her hands at her sides. Then she picked up her shawl from the porch railing and walked toward town. The road into Willow Creek was already filling with people moving in the same direction, men with their hats pulled low and their mouths set. Women with their arms crossed over their chests, the way people hold themselves when they're bracing against something they can't fix. Word travels fast in a small town, and the word that morning was simple and brutal. The orchards were gone. Not all of them. Not every tree stripped to bare wood. But the fruit, the early summer peaches that the valley had been counting on to carry half a dozen farms through the lean months, those were gone. Smashed in the mud. Split open on the ground, bruised past anything a proper buyer would touch. Eleanor reached the edge of the Harmon orchard and stopped. She had walked this road 100 times and never paid much attention to the peach trees lining the fence. But now, standing at the gate with the rest of Willow Creek crowded in behind her, she looked out at what the storm had done, and something shifted in her chest that she couldn't quite name. The ground was covered in fruit. Thousands of peaches, maybe more, lying in the mud and the wet grass. Some were split clean through. Some were barely marked at all, just a dark patch on one side where the hail had caught them wrong. The smell was extraordinary sweet and sharp and alive in a way that made your throat close up a little, because waste that size has its own particular grief to it. "Worthless," said the man standing beside her. She glanced over. She didn't know him well. A farm laborer from somewhere down the valley, one of the seasonal workers who moved through every summer and disappeared before the first frost. "The whole lot of it," he said, shaking his head. "Whitmore won't touch damaged fruit. You couldn't give that away." Eleanor looked back at the peaches. She crouched down right there at the gate in the mud and picked one up. The man made a noise behind her, a short, impatient sound, but she ignored him. She turned the peach over in her hand. The hail had caught it on the left side and left a bruise about the size of a silver dollar skin gone dark and soft in that patch. But the rest of it, the curve of gold and rose, she could see under the damage, the rest of it was perfect. She pressed her thumb to the undamaged side and felt the give of ripe fruit. She lifted it to her face and smelled it. Sweet, deep, full of summer. She set it back down, stood up, and brushed the mud off her knees. Charles Whitmore arrived an hour later in his black coat and his good boots, the ones he wore when he wanted people to remember who held the money in Willow Creek. He was a big man, not tall, but solid, with the kind of face that had learned early how to look like it wasn't surprised by anything. He walked through the crowd with his hands clasped behind his back, and people stepped aside for him, the way they always did. He looked at the ruined orchard for about 30 seconds. Then he turned to the assembled farmers and said, "Gentlemen, I'll give you 50 cents a crate for what's on the ground. That's my offer, and I won't improve it. You can take it or leave it." 50 cents a crate. Eleanor knew what a crate of good peaches brought. She knew what these men had put into their trees, the water hauled, the pruning done by hand in the cold early spring, the weeks of watching and waiting. 50 cents was an insult dressed up as charity. But the farmers looked at each other, and she could see in their faces that they were going to take it. Because what else were they going to do? The fruit was on the ground. It wasn't getting better. "What about the crates you won't buy?" she said. Her voice came out clear and steady, and she was a little surprised by that, because her heart was hammering. Whitmore turned. He looked at her the way men like him often looked at Eleanor, that quick up-and-down inventory that took in her size and her plain dress and her widow's status, and arrived at its conclusion in about 2 seconds flat. "Beg your pardon," he said. "The damaged ones," she said. "The ones you won't take even at 50 cents. What happens to those? They rot, Mrs. Whitaker." He said her name the way you'd say the name of something mildly inconvenient. "That's what happens to spoiled fruit." "I'd like to buy them," she said. Someone laughed. She didn't turn to see who. Whitmore studied her with something that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite contempt, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "You want to buy damaged peaches?" "Yes, sir." "For what purpose?" "That's my concern," she said. "How much?" He named a price almost as a joke. $3 for several crates of the most damaged fruit, the ones even he wouldn't insult a farmer by offering money for. Eleanor reached into the pocket of her apron. She counted out $3 in coins, which was not quite everything she had, but close enough that the difference wouldn't keep her comfortable for long, and she held it out to him. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. And then, because he was a practical man, and $3 was $3, he took the money. The crowd that had gathered to watch the damage assessment stared at her. Some of them whispered. She heard the word "fool" pass through the air like a small stone. She paid it no attention. "I'll need help loading them," she said. In the end, a boy helped her. He appeared at her elbow without her asking, a lean 12-year-old with muddy boots and careful eyes, and he said, "I can help you with that, ma'am." And she said, "What's your name?" And he said, "Samuel Carter." And she said, "All right, Samuel Carter, let's get to work." They loaded the crates into the borrowed wagon in the afternoon heat, Samuel handing up the crates one by one, and Eleanor stacking them with the efficiency of someone who had been doing physical work her whole life, and never had the luxury of finding it beneath her. The other townspeople drifted away in ones and twos. There was nothing else to see here, just the widow who'd lost her mind spending her last dollars on garbage. Whitmore watched them from across the yard. Eleanor felt his eyes on her back the whole time, but she didn't look up. She had work to do. The farmhouse was quiet when they got back. It had been quiet for 2 years since James died of fever in the spring of '82, leaving her with the property and the debts and no particular road forward that anyone else could see. She had kept the place going by sheer will and a refusal to accept the obvious conclusion that everyone else had already drawn. But it had been hard, and it had been lonely, and there were nights when the quiet of the house pressed in on her like something with weight. She set Samuel to work, sorting the fruit at the kitchen table, while she started a fire under the biggest pot she owned. "What are we doing?" he asked. "We're sorting," she said. "Everything that's more than half good goes in that pile. Everything that's past saving goes in the bucket by the door. And Samuel, I want you to look careful. Don't throw away anything that's still got sweetness in it." He looked at her with those careful eyes of his. "Yes, ma'am." They worked through the afternoon and into the evening. Eleanor's hands moved with a precision she hadn't needed in years. The knowledge coming back to her from somewhere deep from her mother's kitchen in Tennessee, when she was young and the peach season meant weeks of work, and the smell of sugar on the stove, and her mother's voice talking her through the steps, the way a person talks through something sacred. Her mother had been a preserver in the old sense, not just a woman who made jam. A woman who understood that preservation was a kind of philosophy, that the whole art of it was learning to see what was still good inside something that looked ruined and having the patience and the skill to bring that goodness out. Eleanor had not made preserves since James died. She hadn't had the time or the heart or the fruit. Now she had all three. She sent Samuel home just before dark, pressing a small coin into his hand and telling him to come back tomorrow if he wanted more work. He looked at the coin, then at her and said, "I'll be here before breakfast, ma'am." And she believed him. She worked alone through the night. The house filled up with steam and the deep golden smell of peaches cooking down, and Eleanor stood at the stove and stirred and tasted and adjusted, adding the vanilla her mother had always insisted on, the pinch of cinnamon that lifted the flavor, without announcing itself, the careful balance of sugar that let the fruit stay forward rather than drowning in sweetness. She wasn't making jam. She knew the difference. Jam was fruit cooked, simple, straightforward, nothing wrong with it. What she was making was a preserve, a thing with body and complexity, where the fruit held its shape inside the jar and the syrup ran gold when you tipped the glass. And the flavor when it hit your tongue was not just peach, but something deeper, summer and effort and time, all held together in glass. She filled the first jars just before dawn. She set them on the windowsill and watched the early light come through them, that color somewhere between amber and gold, and something in her chest eased for the first time in longer than she could remember. She called them golden storm preserves, not because of the golden color, though, that was part of it, but because of where they came from, because of what the storm had left behind that everyone else had walked away from. Because sometimes the most valuable thing in the room is the thing everyone else has decided to throw out. Samuel was at her door before 7 the next morning as promised. He found her already back at work sorting the second crate. "They look beautiful," he said, looking at the jars on the windowsill. "They taste better than they look," she said. "Come in, there's biscuits on the stove." He came in. He ate the biscuits standing up because he was 12 and didn't know yet how to sit still at someone else's table without looking like he was waiting for permission. Eleanor noticed this and said nothing about it. She had been 12 once, and she remembered what it felt like to take up space in the world like an apology. "My mother used to preserve peaches," he said after a while. "Did she?" "Yes, ma'am. She died 2 winters back." Eleanor kept her hands moving in the crate. "I'm sorry, Samuel." She used to say that a good preserve tasted like the summer remembered itself. He paused. "I don't know exactly what that means." "I think I do," Eleanor said quietly. They worked together, in a silence that was comfortable in the way shared work always is, 2 people moving around the same space with the same purpose, and somewhere in the rhythm of it Eleanor found herself thinking that this right here was what she had been missing. Not just company, not just help, but the sense of something building, something growing from effort and care into a thing that hadn't existed before. Outside the window, Willow Creek was picking itself up from the storm. Farmers were calculating losses. The grain exchange was running numbers. Charles Whitmore was already 3 towns away, buying up another harvest at bottom price, from people who had no other choice. The summer that should have been generous had turned cruel, and the valley was settling into the grim arithmetic of making less do more. Nobody was thinking about Eleanor Whitaker. That suited her fine. By the end of the first week, she had filled 40 jars. By the end of the second week, she had filled nearly 100. She sent Samuel to the general store with a small amount of the sugar she'd bought on credit because she needed more, and she traded a jar of preserves to the storekeeper's wife for the cost of the sugar. And the storekeeper's wife tasted a spoonful right there over the counter and said, "Lord above Mrs. Whitaker." And Eleanor said, "I'll need another pound of sugar next week too." And the storekeeper's wife said, "You can have whatever you need." Word began to travel. That was the nature of small towns. You couldn't do anything quietly for long. A farmer's wife stopped Eleanor on the road and asked if there was any way to buy a jar. Then another. Then a woman whose husband had a dry goods route that ran through 3 counties stopped by the farmhouse and asked if Eleanor had considered selling outside of Willow Creek because her husband thought he could move them. Eleanor sat with that for a full evening before she answered, because she understood something that the woman with the dry goods route probably didn't realize she was saying. She was saying what you've made is worth more than anyone here is going to pay you for it. She was saying there's a bigger world out there that doesn't know about you yet, and maybe it's time it did. Eleanor thought about Charles Whitmore and his 50-cent crates and his boots and his quick dismissing look. She thought about the $3 in her apron pocket. She thought about her mother's hands, stained dark with fruit juice, moving through the same motions she was moving through now, and her mother's voice saying, "You learn the value of a thing by what it costs to make it right, not by what someone is willing to pay you to be rid of it." She told the woman yes. She would sell outside of Willow Creek. And that decision made quietly at a kitchen table, in a house that had been too quiet for too long, was the thing that started to bring Charles Whitmore's attention back around in her direction. Because Whitmore had buyers in those other counties. He had relationships built over decades, built on credit and obligation, and the kind of steady pressure that made people think they didn't have options when they did. And a widow selling peach preserves out of a farm kitchen shouldn't have been a threat to any of that. Except the preserves were extraordinary. People who tasted them remembered them. People who remembered them talked. And the talking had a direction to it, a current pulling toward Eleanor's farmhouse and Whitmore, who was a practical man with a good ear for the sound of money moving in directions he hadn't authorized, heard it. He heard it one morning over coffee in the bank manager's office, when the bank manager mentioned in passing that Eleanor Whitaker had paid off a small debt that morning. Cash. Whitmore set down his cup. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "The widow." "That's right," the bank manager said. "Came in first thing. I was surprised. I'll be honest with you, Charles. I'd had her flagged for a conversation about that account." Whitmore said nothing, but he was already thinking. He thought about $3. He thought about the crates of damaged fruit he'd written off without a second look. He thought about the sound of the widow's voice in the orchard, clear and steady in a way he hadn't expected. And he thought about what it meant that she had walked into the bank that morning with cash in her hand. He left the bank manager's office and walked down the main street of Willow Creek, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something he didn't care for. He felt like he'd missed something. He stood outside the dry goods store and watched Mrs. Patterson, the dry goods man's wife, arrange a small pyramid of jars in the window. Gold and amber, the light catching them like something expensive. A hand-lettered card in front of them read, "Golden Storm Preserves, made in Willow Creek, Colorado." Whitmore read the card. He looked at the jars. He thought about the peach that the widow had picked up from the mud. He thought about the way she had turned it over in her hands, deliberate and unhurried, like a woman who already knew what she was looking for and had simply come to confirm it. He had thought she was a fool. He was beginning to reconsider. Back at her farmhouse, Eleanor was teaching Samuel how to seal a jar properly, pressing the lid down firm and true. The ring tightened just enough. "Not too tight," she said. "You leave just a little give. Let the heat do the work." "How do you know when it's right?" he asked. She tipped the jar and watched the preserves move inside slow and golden. "You just know," she said. "After a while, you just know." Samuel nodded like he was filing this away with everything else she'd told him, storing it in some careful place inside himself, where things that mattered were kept. Outside, the summer was still going. The storm had done its damage and moved on the way storms do. The sky over Willow Creek had gone back to being blue and deep and indifferent, and the valley was healing itself the way valleys do, slow and stubborn and without fanfare. And in a farmhouse at the edge of town, A woman who'd spent 2 years being quietly written off was filling jars with gold. She wasn't done. She was just getting started. And somewhere across town, a man who had never lost anything he wanted to keep was beginning to understand that he had made a very significant mistake. The next time he saw Eleanor Whitaker, he intended to correct it. Whether she was going to let him was another matter entirely. Whitmore didn't go to her directly. That wasn't how he operated. Men like Charles Whitmore didn't walk up to a problem and knock on the front door. They circled it first. They sent people ahead to take the temperature of the room. They gathered information the way a farmer gathers water rights quietly and with patience until they owned enough of the flow to control the whole river. So the first thing Eleanor noticed wasn't Whitmore himself. It was the questions. Mrs. Hanford at the dry goods store mentioned almost in passing that a man had come in asking about the Golden Storm preserves. Not to buy any, just asking. How many jars had she moved? Who was buying them? Did she know where Mrs. Whitaker was sourcing her supplies? Eleanor was in the store when Mrs. Hanford told her this, and she kept her face smooth and her hands still on the counter. And she said, "What kind of man?" "A sharp kind," Mrs. Hanford said carefully. "Dressed well, didn't give a name." Eleanor thanked her and walked home, and the whole way she turned the information over in her mind, the way she turned fruit in her hands, looking for the bruise finding the shape of the damage before it surprised her. She knew what it meant. She'd been around enough commerce in her life watching James deal with buyers and brokers to recognize the shape of a man gathering leverage. Whitmore wasn't curious about her preserves. He was calculating them. He was deciding how much they were worth and whether the woman making them could be managed or needed to be removed. She got home and found Samuel already in the kitchen, working through the last of the third crate with the focused silence she'd come to depend on. "We're going to need to move faster," she said. He looked up. "How much faster?" "As fast as we can without cutting corners." Samuel nodded and turned back to the fruit. He didn't ask why. That was one of the things she appreciated most about him. He understood that sometimes the reason behind an instruction was less important than the instruction itself. They worked through that afternoon at a pace that left Eleanor's shoulders aching and her hands raw, and by the time the light changed, they had filled 60 more jars. She carried them to the pantry shelf herself, jar by jar, and she stood back and looked at the rows of them, and felt something that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite fear, but contained elements of both. Because she was building something real now, and real things could be threatened. The second thing she noticed came 3 days later at the farmer's market. She had set up a table at the edge of the square, a plain wooden table with 24 jars arranged on it, and a small card that read what it read. The market had been slow since the hailstorm stripped the orchard's farmers selling what they had left. Customers buying cautiously, the whole economic texture of the town, compressed by the damage the storm had done. But people had started coming to Eleanor's table specifically. Not drifting past it the way market customers drifted, but walking toward it with intention, people who had heard about the preserves from someone who had tasted them and couldn't stop talking about them. An older woman from 2 farms over pressed a jar to her chest like something precious. A man in a wool coat who said he was traveling from Denver tasted the spoonful Eleanor offered and stood very still for a moment before asking how many jars she could sell him. "How many do you need?" she asked. "How many can you make?" "More than I have today," she said. He bought everything she had on the table. She was wrapping the last jars in cloth for his case when she became aware of someone watching her from across the square. She didn't look up right away. She finished what she was doing, counted the man's money, thanked him, and then when she had her composure fully in hand, she looked up. It wasn't Whitmore. It was his man, a thin fellow named Dobbs who functioned as Whitmore's eyes around town, doing small administrative errands and delivering messages and generally being present in the places Whitmore couldn't be without drawing attention. Dobbs was standing near the feed store with his hands in his pockets, watching her table with the expression of someone trying to look like they weren't watching. Eleanor met his gaze straight on. Dobbs looked away first. She drove home with an empty table and a full coin purse, and she sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea going cold in her hands and thought very carefully about what she was up against. Charles Whitmore had not built what he built in Willow Creek by being careless or slow. He controlled the produce buying, which meant he controlled what the farmers grew and what price they expected for it. He controlled the warehouse where most of the valley's preserved goods moved through. He had a relationship with the railroad agent 3 towns over that gave him advance notice of what buyers were coming and what they were looking for. He had spent 20 years constructing a web of dependency and obligation that kept people inside it because they couldn't see the edges. Eleanor could see the edges. That was her advantage. She'd never been inside the web. She was too small, too female, too recently widowed, too easily overlooked. She had been operating outside of Whitmore's system entirely, which meant she hadn't been constrained by it. But that invisibility had a time limit, and she felt it running out. She needed to move before he did. The next morning, she went to see Anna Kowalski. Anna's place was a small farm at the north end of the valley, the kind of property that looked modest from the road and revealed its true character. Only once you were inside it, a house ordered and precise and full of the evidence of decades of careful work. Shelves of preserved goods. A kitchen garden so efficient, it produced twice what you'd expect from half the space. An old woman who moved through it all like she had memorized every inch of the world and found it sufficient. Anna was 71 years old and had been preserving food since before Eleanor was born. She had come to Colorado from Poland with her husband 30 years ago and had outlasted him and the hard winters and 3 crop failures and the particular loneliness of being a foreigner in a town that tolerated rather than welcomed. She was not warm in the surface way that made socializing easy, but she was generous in the deeper way that mattered, the kind of generosity that didn't announce itself. She had given Eleanor jars when Eleanor had nothing. That wasn't something Eleanor forgot. "I need advice," Eleanor said, sitting across from Anna at her kitchen table with a jar of the Golden Storm preserves between them. Anna opened the jar. She dipped a clean spoon and tasted it with the focused attention of someone who did not taste things casually. She said nothing for a full minute. Then, "You used vanilla." "Yes." "Not too much." "No." "And you let the sugar rest before you added the fruit." It wasn't a question. "My mother's method," Eleanor said. Anna looked at her. "Your mother knew what she was doing." "She did." Eleanor paused. "Anna, I think Whitmore is going to come for me." "Of course he is," Anna said, as if this were the most obvious thing in the world. "You built something he doesn't control. That is the only thing Charles Whitmore cannot tolerate." "What do I do?" "You already know what to do," Anna said. "You just want someone to tell you it isn't foolish." Eleanor looked at the jar between them. "Is it foolish?" "Everything worth doing looks foolish from the outside," Anna said. "What is it you're thinking?" "I want to go around him. I want to build relationships with buyers directly, not through any of his channels. I want to get to Denver before he gets to me." Anna was quiet for a moment. "You'll need more product than you can make alone." "Yes? And you'll need someone they'll take seriously when you walk into a room." Eleanor felt that land. It was true, and Anna knew it was true, and she wasn't saying it to be cruel. She was saying it because it was a fact, the same way weather was a fact, the same way distance was a fact. Eleanor was a woman and a widow, and she carried herself with dignity. But dignity alone wouldn't open certain doors. "I was thinking of Mr. Calloway," Eleanor said. "He drove freight to Denver twice a month before his contract with Whitmore ended." "I know Ed Calloway," Anna said. "He's honest." "Mostly," Anna allowed. "Could you speak to him? He'd listen to you before he'd listen to me." Anna studied her. "You're asking me to use my name." "I'm asking you to use it for something worth using it on," Eleanor said. A long pause. "Leave the jar," Anna said finally. Eleanor drove home feeling something she hadn't felt in 2 years. Not hope exactly. Something more grounded than hope. Something more like momentum. The feeling of a thing beginning to move that had been still too long. She was wrong about the timing. Because Whitmore didn't wait. He came to the farmhouse himself 2 days later at mid-morning in his good coat. Samuel was in the kitchen sorting the last of the fruit when they heard the horse on the road, and Eleanor was at the stove, and she said without turning around, "Go in the back, Samuel." "Who is it?" "Go in the back," she said again, quiet and firm. He went. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the front door and opened it before Whitmore had finished climbing down from his horse. She stood in the doorway with her arms loose at her sides, not blocking it exactly, not inviting him in exactly. Just present. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, tipping his hat. "Mr. Whitmore." "I wonder if I might have a word." "You can have them from there," she said pleasantly. Something moved across his face. Not quite surprise. He was too controlled for that, but something adjusted. "I'll be brief," he said. "I believe we may have gotten off on the wrong foot, at the orchard. Did we? I want to make you an offer, a fair one." He named a price per jar. It was better than she'd expected him to open, with which told her two things: he had more information than she'd realized, and he was more interested than he was letting on. She looked at him for a moment without speaking, letting the silence do some work. "That's kind of you," she said, "but I'm not selling." "Not selling any—" "Not to you," she said. "Not at any price." That got through. She saw it. The slight tightening around his eyes, the way his hand moved, and then stopped. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, and his voice had changed just slightly. The pleasantness thinned to something underneath it that was harder and less patient. "I've been doing business in this valley for 20 years. The people I work with prosper. The people who work against me find things considerably more difficult. I'm sure you understand what I mean." "I do," she said. "And I want you to understand what I mean when I tell you that I know exactly who you've been doing business with for 20 years. I know what you paid them. I know what their product was worth, and I know what you offered, and I know what they took because they thought they had no choice." She kept her voice even. "I'm not one of them." He stared at her. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," she said, and she stepped back and closed the door. Inside, the only sound was the preserves on the stove and her own heartbeat, which was considerably faster than her face had let on. She stood with her back against the door for 1 full minute. Then she walked to the back of the house, where Samuel was standing in the narrow hallway with his eyes wide. "Is he gone?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. "But he will be." Samuel looked at her face. "You turned him down." "Yes." "What happens now?" Eleanor moved past him toward the stove, checking the heat under the pot, with the automatic competence of someone who couldn't afford to burn a single jar's worth of fruit. "Now we work faster," she said. She was right to worry. Within the week, things started going wrong in the specific way things go wrong when someone with influence has decided to make them go wrong. The family she'd arranged to buy extra jars from for resale suddenly found themselves unavailable. No explanation. Just a door that didn't open when Eleanor knocked on it. The farmer who had agreed to let her use his wagon for a delivery run to the neighboring town sent his son to tell her the wagon was needed elsewhere. The general store received a visit from a man representing a wholesale buyer in Denver, who was apparently very interested in stocking the store's shelves with a broader range of preserved goods at very competitive prices if the store could commit to an exclusive arrangement for a period of 12 months. Mrs. Hanford told Eleanor about this visit with the strained expression of someone delivering bad news they hadn't asked to be involved in. "I didn't agree to anything yet," she said. "But Eleanor, I have to think about my business." "I understand," Eleanor said. She did understand. That was the part that was hardest to keep herself steady around. She understood why people made these choices. She understood what Whitmore offered and what he threatened, and she understood that most people in this valley had more to lose than she did because she was already at the bottom of what she could afford to lose, which was, in a strange way, a kind of freedom. She went home that evening and sat at the kitchen table with her ledger and her pencil, and she worked the numbers without softening them. What she had, what she needed, what she could do, and what she couldn't. And then she wrote a letter. She wrote to a woman named Margaret Dole in Denver, a name Anna had given her, a woman who ran a supply business and was known for dealing fairly with people who brought her quality goods. Eleanor had never met Margaret Dole. She had nothing to offer her except the quality of the product and the honesty of the letter itself. She wrote it 3 times before she got it right. The first version was too apologetic. The second was too formal. The third was simply true, a woman explaining what she made and why it was worth a buyer's time with no performance of smallness and no overclaiming. She sent it with Ed Calloway on his next run to Denver. She might not respond, Calloway said, not unkindly. She might, Eleanor said. And if she don't, then I'll write the next letter, Eleanor said. Calloway looked at her for a moment with a complicated expression. Something between respect and the specific concern of a man who has watched a number of good people lose to Charles Whitmore over the years. You know what you're doing, he said. It wasn't entirely a question. I'm learning, she said honestly. But I'm learning fast. She was. Every day brought a new lesson, some of them kind and some of them harsh. The harsh ones were instructive in a way the kind ones couldn't be. She learned which people in Willow Creek would hold a position under pressure and which would drift toward whoever applied the most heat. She learned which relationships were built on real regard and which were built on convenience. She learned that the people who had the least were sometimes the most reliable, because they had nothing to protect except their own word, like Samuel. He showed up every single morning without fail. He didn't mention his wages, which were small and sometimes late when Eleanor was moving money around. He didn't ask questions about the business arrangement with Whitmore, or what it meant for his own position. He showed up, did his work with the focused care he brought to everything, and went home. One evening later than she'd meant to keep him, she found herself telling him about her mother. Not in any organized way, just talking while they worked. The way you talk when you've been quiet for too long and the words start to come out sideways. She taught me this recipe when I was about your age, Eleanor said. Sat me down at the table and walked me through it step by step. Said it was the most important thing she could teach me. Preserving, Samuel asked. Looking, Eleanor said. The preserving was just the application. What she was really teaching me was how to look at a thing properly. Not at what it looks like on the outside, at what it actually is. Samuel considered this with the gravity he brought to most things. Like the peaches. Like everything, she said. Like people. He was quiet for a moment. My mama used to say something like that. She said most people only see the surface of a thing. The ones worth knowing see all the way through. Eleanor looked at him. 12 years old, careful-eyed, sitting in a dead woman's kitchen, helping a widow build something out of damage and stubbornness. Your mama sounds like she was a wise woman, Eleanor said. She was, he said simply, and he went back to work. The letter came back from Denver 11 days later. Eleanor was in the kitchen when she heard Calloway's wagon, and she made herself finish what she was doing before she went to the door, because she did not want to be the kind of person who dropped everything at the sound of a horse. She finished sealing the jar in her hands, set it on the shelf, wiped her hands dry, and walked to the door. Calloway was coming up the path with a letter in his hand and an expression she couldn't read. She wrote back, he said. Eleanor took the letter. She didn't open it in front of him. She thanked him, waited until he was back down the path, and then she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and held it for a moment. Samuel was watching her from across the room. Open it, he said quietly. She did. Margaret Dole's handwriting was businesslike and clear. The letter was short. She had received the sample jar Calloway had carried along with the letter. She had tasted the preserves. She was interested. She would like to place an initial order and discuss the possibility of a standing arrangement if the product could be delivered consistently and on schedule. She named a price. It was more than Whitmore had offered. Eleanor set the letter down on the table and looked at it for a long moment. Good news, Samuel asked. Yes, Eleanor said. And then, because she was alone in her kitchen with a 12-year-old boy and no one else to tell, very good news. Samuel broke into the kind of grin she hadn't seen from him before. sudden and unguarded, and completely unlike his usual careful expression. "I knew it," he said. "Don't get ahead of yourself," she said, but she was smiling too. She read the letter twice more that evening, tracing Margaret Dole's terms with one finger, not because she didn't understand them, but because she wanted to feel the reality of them. A real buyer, a real price, a real arrangement that didn't root through Charles Whitmore or depend on his goodwill or require her to keep herself small enough to fit inside the space he'd decided to allow her. She wrote back that night. She accepted the terms. She did not sleep much, but the work she had the next morning was better than it had been before, because now it had a shape to it, a destination, a specific weight and volume and date attached to it. Before she had been building toward something she could feel but not quite see. Now she could see it. She told Calloway she would need his wagon for a Denver run within the month. She told Anna what had happened and watched the old woman's face go still, and then slowly warm in a way that was the closest Anna ever came to open joy. She told Samuel she would need him every day from now on, full days, and that she would pay him a fair wage, starting immediately. And he looked at her with those careful eyes and said, "Yes, ma'am," and then looked down at the table for a moment and said, "Mrs. Whitaker, I appreciate it." "Samuel," she said. "So do I." The thing about momentum is that it looks effortless from the outside. People see the wagon moving, and they don't see the long hours of pushing it uphill before it got to the point where gravity would carry it. They see the full shelves, and don't see the nights Eleanor worked past midnight, the mornings she woke up with her hands aching, the days she counted coins with one eye closed against the arithmetic of not quite enough. But the wagon was moving now, and Charles Whitmore knew it. The evidence of this was not subtle. The same week Eleanor sent her reply to Margaret Dole, a rumor started moving through town that her preserves had made someone sick. Nothing specific, nothing with a name attached to it. Just a murmur, the way rumors move when they're engineered, rather than organic person to person, door to door. Eleanor heard it from Mrs. Hanford, who told her with an apologetic expression, and both hands pressed flat on the counter between them. "I don't believe it," Mrs. Hanford said immediately. "I need you to know that. But people are talking." "Who started it?" Eleanor asked. "I couldn't say." Eleanor looked at her directly. "Couldn't or won't?" Mrs. Hanford looked uncomfortable. "Eleanor, I have to live here." "So do I," Eleanor said quietly. She left the store and walked home with the rumor sitting behind her breastbone like something she'd swallowed wrong. Not because she was afraid it would work, but because of what it revealed about how threatened Whitmore felt. You didn't spend effort on someone you thought was going to fail on their own. You didn't manufacture rumors about a woman making jam in her kitchen if you thought she was going to run out of fruit and give up by winter. He was paying attention to her, which meant she was the right size to worry about. That evening, Eleanor sat down with Samuel and told him plainly what was happening. He was 12, and she had been treating him with the honest respect of someone older because he had earned it, and she saw no reason to manage him differently now. "He's going to try to hurt the business," she said. "The way he can do that is by making people doubt the product. We need people who will speak to what they know, who have tasted the preserves and will say so." "Who?" Samuel asked. "That's what I need to think about," she said. But Samuel was already ahead of her. He had been moving through the town with the particular invisibility of a boy on foot, and he had heard things and seen things, and filed them in that careful interior place of his. "Mrs. Kowalski," he said. "Everyone respects her. She's been here longer than most, and she's never told a lie that anyone knows of." "Anna," Eleanor said. "Yes." "And the Harmon family," he said. "Tom Harmon said to his brother just last week that your preserves were the only reason they were going to make their supply payment this season." Eleanor looked at him. "When did you hear that?" "I'm around," he said simply. She thought about Tom Harmon, a quiet man, third-generation farmer. He had lost more of his crop than most in the hailstorm, and Eleanor had paid him a fair price for the damaged fruit, more than Whitmore would have offered for good fruit in a good year. He had no particular reason to love her, and every practical reason to be grateful. "All right," she said. "I'll talk to Tom in the morning." "And the women from the church circle," Samuel added. "Mrs. Reed and Mrs. Albright. They've both bought jars and they talk." Eleanor almost smiled. "You've been paying a lot of attention." "You told me to look for what's still good inside something that looks damaged," he said. "I figured that applied to people too." She looked at him for a long moment. At the boy who had appeared at her elbow in the mud, who had worked without complaint and without drama, who had turned out to have a mind as careful and precise as the hands he used to sort fruit. "Samuel," she said, "your mother was right about you." He looked at the table, said nothing, but the tips of his ears went red. The next morning Eleanor got up before dawn. She built the fire, set the kettle on, and stood at the window in the dark, looking out at nothing in particular. She was thinking about her mother, about a kitchen that smelled like summer and labor, about hands moving through the same motions she was moving through, about a voice saying things that had taken her 36 years to fully understand. The value of a thing her mother had told her is not decided by the person who wants to pay you the least for it. Eleanor pressed her hand flat against the cold glass of the window. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten at the edges. There was a lot of work to do. She put on her apron and started. Tom Harmon came to the door before Eleanor had finished her second cup of coffee. She heard his boots on the porch, that particular heavy tread of a big man trying to step quiet, and she set her cup down and went to the door before he could knock a second time. He stood there with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly the way men did when they had something uncomfortable to say and hadn't yet decided how to start. "Tom," she said. "Come in." "I won't stay," he said. "I just needed to—" He stopped. Started again. "I heard what's being said about your preserves, Mrs. Whitaker. Making people sick and all." He shook his head. "I want you to know that's not true. My whole family's been eating those preserves since August, and there ain't been a sick day among us." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I know it's not true, Tom. I know you know," he said. "But I wanted you to hear that I know it too. And I wanted you to know that if you need someone to say so publicly, I will." Something in her chest loosened. "That means more than I can say." He nodded, still turning the hat. Then he said more quietly, "Mrs. Whitaker Whitmore came to see me yesterday." She went still. "He offered me a contract," Tom continued. "Better price per crate than I've ever gotten from him. Exclusive arrangement," he said. "Good terms all around." He paused. "All I had to do was stop selling damaged fruit to you." Eleanor held his gaze. "What did you tell him?" Tom Harmon put his hat back on his head and settled it with one firm press. "I told him I'd think about it," he said, "and then I came here." The morning air between them was very quiet. "Tom," she said carefully, "if that contract is good for your family—" "It's a bribe," he said flatly, "and a man who takes a bribe to hurt a neighbor isn't worth the corn he's trying to protect." He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd arrived. "You paid me a fair price for fruit nobody else would touch. You kept my family out of a very bad winter, Mrs. Whitaker. That's not something I forget." She thanked him. She meant it completely. After he left, she stood at the kitchen window and let what he'd told her settle through her. Whitmore was moving. And he was moving faster than she'd expected, which meant the Denver arrangement was more threatening to him than she'd calculated. You didn't offer a man like Tom Harmon a premium contract just to inconvenience a widow. You did it because the widow had become something that needed to be stopped before it grew too large to stop. She was growing. She hadn't let herself say that plainly until now. But it was true. The orders from Margaret Dole had come inconsistent and increasing. The women from the church circle had started telling their daughters and sisters in neighboring towns. 3 weeks ago, a man from a hotel in Colorado Springs had written to ask if she could supply their kitchen. She had written back yes before she fully understood how she would manage the volume, because her mother had also told her never to turn away the door that was opening until you'd at least looked through it. The supply problem was real. She knew it. Samuel knew it. Anna had known it before either of them had put words to it. She needed more fruit, more hands, more jars, and more time. She had access to none of these things at the quantity she needed, and the window for the rest of the peach season was narrowing. If she didn't solve the supply problem in the next 2 weeks, it wouldn't matter what Margaret Dole wanted to order, or what the hotel in Colorado Springs was willing to pay. She put on her coat. She had calls to make. The first was to Anna, who listened to the full situation, with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and her eyes moving over Eleanor's face, with the measuring attention of someone reading a document. "The Reyes family," Anna said when Eleanor finished. "Miguel Reyes over on the South Ridge. He has 40 trees that weren't in the hailstorm's path. His fruit came through clean. He's been trying to sell to Whitmore all season, and Whitmore keeps offering him less than it costs to pick the fruit. He's angry about it, and he's not quiet." Eleanor thought about Miguel Reyes. She didn't know him well. He was quiet at market, kept to his family's Spanish-speaking, and treated by a large portion of Willow Creek with the flat incuriosity people applied to anyone they'd decided didn't quite belong. She had bought tomatoes from his wife once, and the woman had looked genuinely startled to be treated like a regular customer. "Would he sell to me?" Eleanor asked. "Ask him," Anna said simply. "Don't send someone. Go yourself." The second call was harder. She had to go to the bank. The bank manager, a man named Gerald Pierce, was not unkind. He was something more difficult than unkind. He was careful. He had a bank to run, and a community standing to maintain, and a long relationship with Charles Whitmore that predated Eleanor's business by 15 years. He was the kind of man who managed risk the way you'd manage a fire from a careful distance with his hands behind his back. Eleanor walked into his office and sat down across from him and put her ledger on the desk between them. "I need a line of credit," she said. "For supplies. Jars, sugar, additional labor. I can show you the orders I'm running against." Pierce looked at the ledger. He turned pages carefully the way you handle something that might tell you something you'd rather not know. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "this is impressive." "The numbers are honest," she said. "I can see that." He paused. "I'll be frank with you. I've had a conversation recently that complicates this." She kept her face still. "With Mr. Whitmore." The slight pause before he answered was its own answer. "I'm not at liberty to discuss who I speak with about bank business." "Mr. Pierce," Eleanor said, "I have documented orders from a Denver buyer, a standing inquiry from a Colorado Springs hotel, and over 200 jars sold in the last 6 weeks at margins. I can show you line by line. I am asking you to look at what is in front of you and make a decision based on what you see." He looked at her for a long moment. "The credit you're asking for is modest," he said finally. "Yes. And the orders you're showing me are real. You can write to Margaret Dole and verify them yourself." Another pause. Then he turned another page in the ledger, and Eleanor could see him making the decision the same way she'd watched men make decisions her whole life. The small internal pivot from what someone had suggested to what the evidence actually required. "I'll approve a 60-day line," he said, "at standard rate." What? She walked out of the bank into the afternoon light and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of pure relief. Then she put it away and went to find Miguel Reyes. She found him on the South Ridge where Anna said he'd be working his orchard alone. He was a compact man in his 50s, with weathered hands and the careful measuring look of someone who'd been surprised by unkindness enough times to stop expecting anything different. He watched her walk up the row toward him with an expression that wasn't unfriendly, but wasn't warm either, waiting to see what she was. "Mr. Reyes," she said, "my name is Eleanor Whitaker. I make preserves over on the east side." "I know who you are," he said, not rude, just stating a fact. "I need fruit," she said. "Good fruit properly picked. I'll pay you above market, and I'll pay cash within 10 days of delivery." He studied her. "Above market. How much above?" She named a price. He didn't react immediately. He turned and looked at his trees for a moment, the way a man looks at something he's been worrying over for a long time. "Whitmore offered me less than that for grade A fruit," he said. "I know," she said. Why would you pay more? Because your fruit is worth more, she said. And because I need what you can grow, and I'd rather pay you fairly and have you as a reliable partner than pay you poorly and have you go somewhere else. He looked at her directly. You're not like most people I deal with. I've been told that, she said. Usually not as a compliment. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. When do you need the first delivery? He asked. By the time she drove home that afternoon, she had a bank credit line, a fruit supplier, and a short list of women Anna had mentioned who did piecework and might be willing to help in the kitchen for fair wages. She had a clear path forward, and she also had in the back of her mind the quiet knowledge that none of it would matter if Whitmore found a way to cut off the road before she got to the end of it. That night, she sat down and wrote careful letters to Margaret Dole and to the hotel in Colorado Springs, telling them plainly what she was building and what they could expect and on what schedule. She did not oversell. She did not promise more than she could deliver. She wrote the way her mother had preserved, with precision and without ornamentation, letting the substance of the thing speak for itself. She sealed the letters. She went to bed. She slept better than she had in weeks. The trouble started on a Wednesday. It came in a form she hadn't anticipated, which was its own lesson. One she filed away with everything else this season had taught her. She had expected Whitmore to come at the business, at the supply chain, at the buyers, at her reputation. She had been watching for all of those things. She had not been watching for what he actually did. He went after Samuel. She found out the way you find out about things in a small town from someone who couldn't quite look you in the eye while they told you. Mrs. Reed from the church circle stopped her on the road and said with visible discomfort that she had heard Dobbs talking to two men near the feed store the day before, and the gist of what Dobbs had said was that the Carter boy working for Mrs. Whitaker had a habit of helping himself to things that didn't belong to him. Eleanor stood very still in the middle of the road. Who was he saying this to? She asked. The Harford brothers, Mrs. Reed said. They do most of the loading work at Whitmore's warehouse. The Harford brothers, who were also, Eleanor knew, the brothers of the woman Samuel sometimes stayed with when his living situation at his current boarding place became difficult. Who were, in other words, people with some influence over where a 12-year-old homeless boy slept at night. She thanked Mrs. Reed and went straight home. Samuel was in the kitchen. He looked up when she came in, and something in her face made him put down what he was holding. What happened? He asked. She told him, plainly without softening it, because he deserved the truth, and she wasn't going to start managing him now. He went very still. The way he went still when something was coming at him that he didn't have a defense against. She had seen that look before on his face, and on other faces, the look of a person who has learned to wait out pain because fighting it has never done any good. It's not true, he said. I know it's not true, she said. Does it matter? He said. And the weight in those 3 words was not a 12-year-old's weight. It was something older and harder and terribly familiar. Eleanor pulled a chair out from the table and sat down, so she wasn't standing over him. It matters, she said, and I'm going to make sure it matters. But I need to know something first. Is there anyone in this town besides the Harford family who has any kind of say over where you live? He thought about it. Mrs. Bell at the boarding house. She's the one who decides if I stay. Is she a reasonable woman? She's fair, he said. She doesn't listen to gossip usually. Usually, Eleanor repeated. She listened to Dobbs once before, he said. About the Moreno boy. He got put out over it. Eleanor looked at him. He was holding himself very carefully, the way you hold yourself when you're trying to keep something from showing. Samuel, she said. I want to ask you something, and I need a straight answer. Yes, ma'am. Would you be willing to stay here, not as a worker, as... She paused, choosing words carefully. As someone who belongs here. I have the room, and you'd have a proper place, and it would take the Harford brothers and Mrs. Bell and Dobbs completely out of the equation. He looked at her. For a moment, his face was entirely unguarded. She saw everything that moved through it, the hope and the caution behind the hope, and the fear behind the caution, and underneath all of it, the bone-deep exhaustion of a child who had been looking for a steady place to stand for a very long time. "You mean that," he said. "I don't say things I don't mean," she said. He looked down at the table. His jaw worked. "Yes," he said. "I'd be willing." "Good," she said. "Then that's settled." She got up and went back to the stove because she knew he needed a moment, and giving him one was the most dignified thing she could do. She heard him exhale behind her, slow and shaky, the sound of someone putting down something heavy. She didn't turn around. She gave him the space to put himself back together. And when he came to stand beside her at the stove a few minutes later, his face was its usual careful self, and she handed him a wooden spoon and said, "Watch the temperature on this batch," and he said, "Yes, ma'am," and they worked. The next morning, Eleanor went to see Mrs. Bell. Mrs. Bell was a practical woman with a boarding house to run and a reputation for running it honestly, and she listened to Eleanor with the focused attention of someone who understood that the conversation had stakes on both sides. Eleanor laid it out plainly. Samuel was a careful, honest, hard-working boy. She wanted him to come live at her property and work full-time in the business she was building. She would take full responsibility for him. What she needed from Mrs. Bell was confirmation that there was no reason, no legitimate reason, that this arrangement couldn't move forward. Mrs. Bell looked at her steadily. "You heard about what Dobbs said?" "I did," Eleanor said. "You believe it?" "Not for a second." Mrs. Bell nodded slowly. "Neither do I," she said. "That boy's never taken so much as an extra biscuit without asking." "But Eleanor, when Whitmore's people start putting names in the air—" "I know," Eleanor said. "That's why I'm here. I want to make sure Samuel doesn't spend another night worrying about where he stands." Mrs. Bell was quiet for a moment. "He's talked about you," she said. "The boy. He thinks you hung the moon, not that he'd say it in those words." Eleanor felt something sharp and sweet move through her chest. "He's good people," she said quietly. "He is," Mrs. Bell agreed. "All right, you take him. And Eleanor," she paused, "watch yourself. Whitmore going after a child is a new low even for him." "I noticed that," Eleanor said. She walked back to the farmhouse, feeling the gravity of it settle in. Whitmore going after Samuel was not a random move. It was a message. It was designed to distract her, to pull her attention off the business and onto a personal crisis, to make her spend time and emotional resources defending someone she cared about instead of building what she was building. It was also designed to frighten her. She let the fear move through her, and then she let it go, the way her mother had taught her to do with things she couldn't stop. You felt it fully. Then you set it down. The following week was the hardest she had managed since the business began. The shipment to Margaret Dole went out on Calloway's wagon, 240 jars, carefully packed and loaded at 4 in the morning, because that was when Calloway needed to leave to make Denver by afternoon. Eleanor was there for the loading, Samuel beside her, and when the wagon rolled out of sight, she stood on the road for a moment in the dark and let herself feel the enormity of what she had just sent out into the world. Then she went back to work. 2 days later, the shipment arrived and Margaret Dole sent a brief note by return post. The note said 2 things. First, that she had already sold half the order to 3 different buyers and had orders for more. Second, that she would like to increase the next delivery by 40%. Eleanor read the note aloud to Samuel. He said 40%. "Yes." "Can we do that?" "We're going to," she said. They increased the next order. Miguel Reyes delivered on schedule his fruit clean and properly picked exactly what he'd promised. The 3 women Anna had recommended turned out to be efficient and reliable and willing to work early mornings, which was when Eleanor needed them most. The kitchen that had been her mother's teaching ground, and then her grief place, and then her small experimental production floor had become something larger, louder, warmer, and more alive than she could have imagined 4 months ago. It was around this time that the town began to shift. Eleanor noticed it in small ways at first. The way people greeted her at market, not the careful, slightly apologetic greeting they'd been giving her since Whitmore started his campaign, but something warmer and more direct. Mrs. Albright stopped her specifically to say that she had served Eleanor's preserves at a dinner for her husband's business associates, and two of them had asked where they could order more. Tom Harmon tipped his hat when he passed her on the road and said, "How's business, Mrs. Whitaker?" in a tone that expected a good answer. The storekeeper's wife had quietly taken down the exclusive wholesale arrangement proposal that Whitmore's man had brought in and restocked her window with the Golden Storm jars. People were watching Eleanor and Whitmore and making calculations. That was the plain truth of it. They were watching to see who was going to win. And for the first time, Eleanor understood that she was going to win. Not because she was powerful. She wasn't. Not because she had allies with influence. She had very few. Not because she had outmaneuvered a man who had spent 20 years learning every angle of commercial leverage in this valley. She was going to win because she had built something real. Something people actually wanted. Something that existed because she had picked up a bruised peach from the mud and seen the sweetness underneath. And real things in the end had a durability that manufactured power couldn't match. She was thinking about this one evening late, when Samuel had already gone to his room, when she heard a horse on the road again. She'd learned by now not to tense at that sound. She went to the window and looked out. It was Whitmore, but this time he wasn't alone. There were two men with him, neither of whom she recognized, both dressed better than Willow Creek men usually dressed. And the way Whitmore sat his horse was different from the last time he'd come to her door. He wasn't coming to negotiate. She understood that immediately, the way you understand certain things in your body before your mind catches up. He wasn't coming to make a deal. He was coming to deliver a consequence. She straightened her back. She put her hand on the door, and she opened it before he reached the porch. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. He looked up at her from the yard, and in the last of the evening light, she could see that his face had lost whatever remained of the polite overlay he'd been wearing. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "these gentlemen represent a legal interest in a matter I think we need to discuss." She looked at the two men. Legal interest. That was the shape of it. He had found something or manufactured something, some claim against her property or her credit or her right to operate. Her heart was hammering, but her voice was perfectly level when she said, "Then you'd better come in." She turned and walked back into the kitchen. She put the kettle on because her hands needed something to do. Behind her the door opened, and Charles Whitmore and his legal men walked into her house, and Eleanor Whitaker turned around to face them. The two men Whitmore brought with him were named Calder and Fitch. Calder was the one who talked. He was a Denver lawyer with a leather case and the smooth, practiced voice of a man who had delivered bad news to enough people that he'd stopped seeing their faces when he did it. Fitch was quieter, older, and carried himself with the specific stillness of someone whose job was to make sure the other person understood that leaving wasn't an option until the conversation was finished. Eleanor set 3 cups on the table. She did not ask if they wanted coffee. She poured it and set it in front of them, and sat down across from Whitmore with her hands flat on the table, and she waited. Calder opened his case. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "I'll be direct with you. There is a lien on this property filed against your late husband's estate in the amount of $212, originating from a commercial debt to the Willow Creek Merchant Cooperative in 1881. That debt was never settled before Mr. Whitaker's death, and under Colorado territorial statute, it transfers to the surviving heir." He paused. "That's you, ma'am." Eleanor looked at the paper he laid on the table. She had known about the debt. She had known about it the way you know about a rock in a field you've been walking around for 2 years, carefully, deliberately, because you couldn't afford to deal with it directly. James had borrowed against the property when the first winter after they arrived stripped the kitchen garden to nothing, and they needed feed for the animals and flour for the winter. He had intended to pay it back by spring. Then he died, and the debt sat, and Eleanor had been managing it in her mind as something she'd address when the business got strong enough. It wasn't strong enough yet. Not by $212. "The cooperative," she said carefully, "is under whose management now?" Calder glanced at Whitmore. Whitmore said nothing, but the glance was its own answer. Eleanor looked at the paper again. Then she looked at Whitmore directly. "You bought the debt," she said. He met her eyes. The cooperative transferred certain outstanding accounts. It's a common commercial practice. When? She asked. Recently, he said. How recently? A pause. That's not relevant to... It is relevant, she said, keeping her voice even. Because if you acquired that debt after I declined your offer for the business, then what you're doing here tonight isn't debt collection. It's retaliation. And I imagine a Denver lawyer knows the difference between those two things. Calder's expression did something small and involuntary. She filed that away. The debt is legally valid, he said, regardless of when it was acquired. I'm not disputing the debt, Eleanor said. I'm disputing the timing and the purpose. She stood up. Gentlemen, I'd like you to leave now. Whitmore didn't move. Mrs. Whitaker, you don't have $200. We both know that. The reasonable resolution here is... I said good night, Mr. Whitmore. He looked at her for a long moment, the look of a man deciding whether to escalate. Then he stood slowly and buttoned his coat. You have 30 days, Calder said, collecting his papers, after which the lien can be executed and the property... I heard you, Eleanor said. She held the door until all three of them were through it. She closed it. She turned the latch. Then she stood in the middle of her kitchen and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened, because her mother had also taught her never to run from the true size of a problem. You looked at it straight. You let it be as large as it actually was. And then you figured out what to do next. $212 in 30 days. She sat down. Samuel's door opened. He stood in the hallway in his work clothes because she suspected he hadn't actually been sleeping, and looked at her face. How bad, he said. She told him. He came and sat across from her at the table, and they looked at the number together, the way you look at a problem you both have to solve. Can you get it from the Denver sales? He asked. Not in 30 days. Not reliably. Margaret Dole pays net 45. Mrs. Kowalski. I won't ask Anna for money, Eleanor said. She's given enough. Tom Harmon. She shook her head. Tom has his own debt. The hailstorm hit him hard. Samuel was quiet for a moment. He had his thinking face on the one that meant he was going through everything methodically, the way he sorted fruit patient and precise, not discarding anything until he'd examined it. The hotel in Colorado Springs, he said. The one that wrote to you. I can't produce enough product fast enough for an order that would cover it. What if you ask them for an advance, he said. On a confirmed future order. Some buyers do that. Eleanor looked at him. She had not thought of that. Not because it wasn't sensible, but because her whole life she had been conditioned to believe that asking for things in advance of delivering them was presumptuous. The kind of boldness reserved for men with connections and established names, not widows operating out of a farm kitchen. She thought about Margaret Dole's letter, about the tone of it, the directness, the way it had addressed her as a business correspondent rather than a charity case. I'd have to offer them something worth advancing against, she said slowly. An exclusive arrangement for a season, first right of supply. They want your preserves, Samuel said. You said the man's letter was eager. He was eager, she admitted. Then he might be willing. She sat with it for the moment, turning it over. It was a risk. If the hotel advanced her money, and she couldn't deliver the product on time, she'd damage the relationship, and still owe the debt. But if she didn't try, she had 30 days, and not enough in the account, and Whitmore would execute that lien, and she would lose the farmhouse, and everything she'd built would dissolve back into nothing. And Samuel would be without a home again, and all the work, and the jars, and the golden light of the first sunrise through the glass would have amounted to an interesting story that ended badly. She picked up her pen. I'm going to write 2 letters tonight, she said. One to the hotel, one to Margaret Dole explaining the situation and asking if there is any way to accelerate payment on the current order. That's telling her Whitmore is coming after you, Samuel said. Yes, Eleanor said. It is. She wrote both letters before midnight and handed them to Calloway at first light. He looked at her face, looked at the letters, and said, I'll ride faster than usual. Thank you, Ed, she said. She went back inside and started the morning's work. The thing about a threat with a deadline is that it changes the quality of every hour. Time that had previously moved at the pace of manageable effort now had weight to it. She felt it in everything she did. The fruit she cut the jars, she sealed the accounts she checked and rechecked. 30 days sounds like a long time until you start subtracting from it and find out how fast a number goes to zero. She did not tell Anna the full situation. She told her enough, framing it as a temporary cash flow difficulty, because Anna would have immediately offered money, and Eleanor was not going to do that to a 71-year-old woman on a fixed income. But Anna, who missed very little, looked at her with those sharp eyes and said, "Whitmore." "Yes," Eleanor said. "He found a legal instrument. He manufactured one, but the debt is real." Anna was quiet. Then she said something unexpected. "How many people in this town owe you something?" Eleanor frowned. "I'm not in the business of keeping that kind of score." "I'm not talking about money," Anna said. "I'm talking about something else. The Harmon family, Miguel Reyes, Mrs. Hanford, the women you hired, the people who bought your preserves at a fair price when they couldn't afford more. How many of them know what Whitmore is doing?" Eleanor looked at her. "I don't want to involve people in my—" "Eleanor," Anna said, and her voice had the particular firmness of someone who had lived long enough to know when sentiment was getting in the way of sense. "You have spent the last 4 months building something that has helped a great many people in this valley. Tom Harmon kept his farm because of what you paid him. Miguel Reyes has his best season in 4 years because of you. The women you hired have income they didn't have before." She paused. "These people aren't just your neighbors. They are your community, and a community that doesn't know it's under threat cannot defend itself." Eleanor sat with that for a long time after she left Anna's house. She didn't like it. The part of her that had always handled difficulty privately, that had held her chin up and her problems close and never asked for more than she'd earned, that part resisted it completely. It felt too much like weakness. Too much like the widow asking for help, which was a thing she had spent 2 years refusing to do. But Anna was right. This wasn't just about her. It hadn't been just about her for a long time. She called it a community meeting, which was perhaps too formal a word for the dozen people who gathered in the Harmon family's barn on a Thursday evening, having been told by Tom that Mrs. Whitaker had something important to say. They came. That was the first thing. Without obligation, without advance knowledge of what she was going to tell them, they came. Tom and his wife. Miguel Reyes and his oldest son. Anna, who sat in the corner with her hands in her lap and said nothing. Mrs. Hanford. 2 of the women from the kitchen. Samuel, who stationed himself near the wall with his arms crossed and watched everyone with his careful eyes. Eleanor stood in front of them and told them the truth, not the version that made her look stronger than she felt, not the version that minimized the danger. The full truth, the debt, the timeline, the lien, the fact that Whitmore had bought it specifically to remove her, and what would happen to the business and to their arrangements if he succeeded. She watched their faces while she talked. Tom Harmon's went hard and closed the look of a man who had suspected something and was now having it confirmed. Miguel Reyes looked at his son and then back at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Mrs. Hanford pressed her lips together. When she finished, the barn was quiet. Then Tom said, "How much?" $212, she said. He looked around the room. "I can put in 30, he said. "I don't have it liquid, but I can get it." "Tom, I'm not asking anyone to—" "I know you're not asking," he said. "I'm offering. There's a difference." He looked at Miguel Reyes. "Miguel," Reyes looked at Eleanor steadily. "You paid me what my fruit was worth," he said. "Nobody's done that before. I can put in 20. Mrs. Hanford said quietly, "I have some money set aside. I can do 15. Eleanor stood in that barn and felt something crack open in her chest that she hadn't known was closed. One by one they named numbers. Not large ones. There were no wealthy people in that room. But the numbers added up the way small things add up when enough people bring them together steadily with weight. They didn't reach 212. They reached 160. $52 short. The room went quiet again. Samuel uncrossed his arms from the wall. "I have $11, he said. "Saved from wages." Every head in the barn turned toward him. He stood his ground, 12 years old and perfectly straight-backed. "That's your savings, Samuel?" Eleanor said. "I know what it is," he said. "Mrs. Whitaker, you gave me a home when you didn't have to. You gave me work when nobody else saw a reason to. You told me my mother was right about things when I'd started to think maybe she wasn't." His voice was steady, steadier than hers would have been. "If I've got $11 and this is what it's needed for, then this is what it's for." Eleanor couldn't speak for a moment. The room was very still. She was $41 short. It was Anna who broke the silence. "I have $45, Anna said from her corner. "In my house. I will bring it tomorrow morning." "Anna, I told you I wouldn't. You told me you wouldn't ask," Anna said crisply. "I'm not being asked. I'm deciding." She fixed Eleanor with a look that had decades of winters and stubbornness and survival behind it. "I have lived in this valley for 30 years, and I have watched that man take from people who could not afford to lose what he took. I have watched because I was old, and I was foreign, and I told myself it was not my fight." She paused. "It was always my fight. I was simply afraid to say so." She looked around the room. This woman built something honest in a dishonest situation. That is worth $45. Nobody said anything. Then Tom Harmon said, "I reckon it's worth considerably more than that." And something shifted in the room that Eleanor couldn't quite name. Something that had to do with people recognizing themselves in a shared purpose, which was a thing that didn't happen often, and when it did, changed things permanently. They had enough. Eleanor paid the debt 2 weeks before the deadline. She walked into Gerald Pierce's bank with $212 in an envelope and set it on his desk and said, "I'd like to pay the lien in full." Pierce looked at the envelope. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that was adjacent to embarrassment. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "I want you to know I didn't—" "I know Gerald," she said, not unkindly. "Can you process this today?" He processed it that afternoon. She walked out of the bank into the main street of Willow Creek with the receipt in her pocket and the extraordinary lightness of a debt paid and a threat removed, and she stopped on the sidewalk and stood very still for a moment, just feeling it. The letters had also come back. The hotel in Colorado Springs had agreed to an advance, not the full amount she'd needed, but a significant portion, and Margaret Dole had written back with a warmth that was unusual for her brief businesslike correspondence. She had also, almost in passing, mentioned that she had spoken to 2 other buyers about Golden Storm preserves and that she expected inquiries shortly. The business was not just surviving. It was growing in directions Eleanor hadn't reached for yet, and Whitmore had used his best weapon, the legal instrument, the financial lever, the kind of pressure that had dismantled a dozen smaller operations over the years, and it had not worked. He found out she'd paid the lien through Pierce, presumably because Pierce was a banker and couldn't keep a poker face worth a damn, and when he found out he did something Eleanor had not expected. He came to her again, not with lawyers this time, alone. He came to market day, and he walked to her table, and he stood in front of her jars with the expression of a man who had been in a war he expected to win quickly, and had discovered it was going to be longer and more expensive than he'd budgeted for. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. People nearby were watching. She knew that. She knew every person within 20 feet had gone quiet and slightly still in the particular way of people who want to hear something without appearing to listen. "I underestimated you," he said. She looked at him. "I won't make that mistake again," he said. And here was the thing about that sentence. It could mean several things. It could be a threat, the refinement of one "I underestimated you. And now I'll come at you harder and smarter." It could be a grudging concession, the kind that didn't come easy to a man like him, and therefore cost something real to say. It could be the opening of a negotiation, a repositioning. I acknowledge you are harder to remove than I thought. So let's discuss what arrangement benefits us both. Eleanor had learned in these months to listen past the words to the thing underneath them. What she heard underneath Whitmore's words was something she hadn't heard before. She heard uncertainty. He had tried the offer. He had tried the rumor. He had tried the social pressure and the supply chain interference and the legal instrument. And she was still standing behind her table with her jars in a row and a line of customers waiting. He didn't know what to try next. "You'll have to do as you see fit," she said. "Same as always." He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded. Once. And he walked away. It was not a surrender. She knew better than to call it that. Men like Whitmore didn't surrender. They retreated to more favorable ground and waited for a better angle. But it was a withdrawal real and visible in the middle of the main street of Willow Creek in front of God and every neighbor they shared. And people saw it. Tom Harmon, standing by the feed bags 20 feet away, met her eye and gave her one short nod. Miguel Reyes, 2 tables down with his remaining produce, allowed himself a small, satisfied expression. Samuel, who was helping a customer count change at Eleanor's table, looked up and caught the moment, and said nothing, but his careful eyes were bright. Eleanor picked up the next jar, checked the seal, and set it in front of the next customer. "What can I do for you?" she said, because the work was still there. It would always be there. The work didn't pause for your victories any more than it paused for your setbacks. And she had learned that lesson too, these long months, that the discipline of showing up every single day was not separate from the success she was building. It was the success she was building. But that evening, after the market was packed up and the wagon was heading home, and Samuel was counting the day's earnings with the focused satisfaction of someone who had learned to love a good number, Eleanor let herself think about what had happened. She thought about the barn. She thought about Tom Harmon saying 30 and Miguel Reyes saying 20, and the women from the kitchen offering what they could spare, and Anna sitting in the corner, with 45 years of held-back fight finally finding its direction. She thought about Samuel standing up from the wall and offering $11, and his steady voice saying, "You gave me a home when you didn't have to." She thought about what her mother had said about the value of a thing. She thought she understood it better now. The value of what she had built was not only in the preserves. It was not only in the orders from Denver and the advance from Colorado Springs and the receipt in her pocket from Gerald Pierce's bank. It was in the barn on a Thursday evening, in the room full of people who had decided that something worth protecting was worth protecting even at personal cost. She had built a product. But she had also, without quite intending, to build a community. And a community was harder to dismantle than a business. A great deal harder. Samuel counted the last coin and looked up. "Best market day yet," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. She let herself smile. "Let's go home," she said. The best market day yet turned out to be the second best market day of the year. The best came 3 weeks later, on the first Saturday of September, when the valley had cooled enough that people moved through the square with a different energy. Not the sluggish patience of high summer, but something crisper and more purposeful. The energy of people who understood that the generous season was ending and there were things still to be done before winter closed the door. Eleanor had 2 tables that day. She had never needed 2 before. Samuel managed one. She managed the other. Miguel Reyes' son, a quiet 17-year-old named Ernesto, who had started helping with deliveries 2 weeks back, stood between the tables and kept the inventory moving from the wagon to the display in a steady rotation that kept both tables looking full, even as the jars walked off them, one by one. By noon they had sold more than Eleanor had moved in her first 3 weeks combined. She let herself feel that. Standing between her 2 tables in the September light, watching her neighbors buy what she'd made from fruit everyone else had thrown away. She let herself feel the fullness of it without immediately running to the next task, or measuring it against what still needed to be done. She was not finished. Not even close. But she had built a thing that was real and large enough now that 2 tables couldn't contain it, and that was worth feeling completely before she moved on. Samuel appeared at her elbow with the cash box and a look on his face that said he'd already run the morning's numbers in his head. "We're going to run out before 2 o'clock, he said. "I know," she said. "We should put a note on the table. Take names for the next order." "You already have the paper out," she said. It wasn't a question. He held it up. He'd written, "Reserve your jar," across the top in his careful handwriting. She looked at it, looked at him, thought about the boy who had appeared at her elbow in the mud of a ruined orchard 5 months ago, offering to load crates for a woman everyone thought was a fool, and the person standing beside her now. "Put it out," she said. By 1:30, they were sold out, and the reservation list had 22 names on it. Eleanor was packing the empty crates into the wagon when she heard a voice she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Whitaker." She turned. The man standing behind her was neither young nor old, somewhere in the middle years that are hard to read precisely. He was dressed for travel road dust on his coat, and he held his hat in both hands, with the slightly formal posture of someone delivering a professional communication. "Yes," she said. "My name is Robert Halloway. I represent the Halloway Brothers Supply Company out of Denver." He paused. "We supply preserved goods, specialty foods, and quality pantry items to hotels, restaurants, and residential clubs across Colorado and into Wyoming. We've been made aware of your Golden Storm preserves through a mutual contact." Eleanor kept her hands moving on the crate because her hands were better off busy. "Margaret Dole," she said. "Among others," he said. "Mrs. Whitaker, I tasted your product last week at the Brown Palace Hotel in Denver. I'd like to discuss a supply arrangement." She stopped moving. The Brown Palace. That was not a small hotel. That was not a regional operation or a territorial outpost. The Brown Palace was the finest establishment in Denver, the kind of place presidents stayed, the kind of place that stocked its pantry with the same careful attention it applied to every other element of the guest experience. She looked at him directly. "What kind of arrangement?" "A significant one," he said. "I'll be honest with you. We've been looking for a quality preserve supplier for the premium market for 2 years. What we've found is either consistent but mediocre or excellent but unreliable. What you're making is both excellent and, based on what Margaret Dole tells me, consistent." He paused. "She speaks very highly of you." "She's a fair woman," Eleanor said. "She is. Which is why I trust her word." He reached into his coat and produced a card. "I'd like to sit down with you at your convenience. I have a proposal I think you'll find worth hearing." Eleanor took the card. She looked at it. Brown Palace Hotel, Denver, Colorado. She put it in her apron pocket. "I can see you Thursday," she said. "Here, 8 in the morning." "I'll be here," he said. He put his hat back on. "Mrs. Whitaker, I don't know what you were doing before this, but whatever it was, I suspect it was the world's loss." He walked away. Eleanor stood beside her empty wagon and held very still. Samuel came around the back of the wagon and looked at her face. "Who was that?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment. "The Brown Palace," he said. "Yes." "That's in Denver." "Yes, Samuel. That's—" He stopped, started again. "Mrs. Whitaker, that's the biggest hotel in Colorado." "I'm aware," she said. Another pause. "You didn't look excited when he told you." "I don't look excited where people can see it," she said. She picked up the last crate. "Help me load this." He picked up the other end of the crate. They walked it to the wagon together. "Are you excited now?" he asked. "Extremely," she said. He laughed. She hadn't heard him laugh like that before, open and unguarded, the laugh of a boy who had been allowed to be a boy for a moment, and it was the best sound she had heard in a very long time. They drove home in the gold of the late afternoon, and the valley had never looked more like itself, wide and clear, and full of what people had managed to grow out of hard ground through long effort. Eleanor held the reins and let the horses set their own pace, and thought about Thursday. She thought about what it would mean if the Halloway arrangement came through. She thought about what it would require. More labor, more supply. A level of consistent production that she had been building toward, but hadn't fully achieved yet. She ran the numbers in her head the way she always did, not trying to make them come out better than they were, just trying to see them clearly. It was possible. Not easy, but possible. And then she thought about what Whitmore would do when he found out, because he would find out. He always found out. And a supply arrangement with the Brown Palace Hotel was not the kind of thing he could address with a manufactured rumor or a purchased debt. It was the kind of thing that moved her outside the territory he controlled entirely. Which meant he had a limited window in which to do something drastic. She was still thinking about this when they got home, and she was still thinking about it at the kitchen table that evening when Samuel had gone to his room, and she was still thinking about it when she woke up at 3 a.m. with a certainty in her chest that she had missed something. She lay in the dark and worked through it. Whitmore was a practical man. She had never stopped respecting that, even when she was opposing him. He didn't make moves that didn't have logic behind them. The lien had been practical. The rumors had been practical. The approach to Tom Harmon and the interference with her supply lines had all been practical, calculated applications of the leverage he had. What would a practical man do when he ran out of ordinary leverage? He'd find extraordinary leverage. She sat up. She lit the lamp. She thought about what she had that he might still be able to reach. The bank credit was paid. The debt was paid. The buyers were established. The suppliers were loyal. Samuel was safe. What was left? She thought about Calloway. Ed Calloway, who ran her freight to Denver. Who was her connection to Margaret Dole and to Robert Halloway and to everything outside Willow Creek that had made the business what it was. Ed Calloway, who was a free agent, an independent freight man, a man with his own debts and his own pressures and his own history in this valley. Ed Calloway, whom Whitmore had used as a freight contractor for years before a disagreement over rates had ended that arrangement. She knew in the particular way she had come to know things, in these months, sharp and certain and arriving whole, that Whitmore was going to approach Calloway. Had possibly already done so. She got dressed in the dark. She drove to Calloway's at 4 a.m, the horses annoyed about it, the road pale under a half moon. She knocked on his door. He opened it after a moment, rumpled and squinting. "Eleanor," he said. "It's 4 a.m. Has Whitmore talked to you?" she said. A pause. The wrong kind of pause. "Ed," she said. "Has he?" Calloway rubbed a hand over his face. "Come inside." She came inside. He poured coffee, neither of them particularly wanted, and sat across from her at his kitchen table and told her what had happened 2 days ago, the meeting he hadn't mentioned because he hadn't decided what to do about it yet, and he hadn't wanted to worry her before he'd worked it out. Whitmore had offered him a freight contract. 3 years, better rates than he currently made doing piecework for a dozen different clients. Steady work, which was what every independent freight man wanted more than almost anything else. All he had to do was stop carrying for Eleanor Whitaker. Eleanor held her coffee cup in both hands and listened. "I didn't say yes," Calloway said quickly. "But you didn't say no," she said. He looked at the table. "Eleanor, 3 years of guaranteed work is—" "I know what it is," she said. "I know exactly what it is, Ed." He looked up. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," she said. "Tell me what you decided." He was quiet for a moment. "I was going to tell you this morning," he said. "I was going to come over first thing and tell you." He met her eyes. "I'm not taking it. I wanted you to hear that from me directly." Something released in her chest. "Ed, you've been straight with me," he said. "You've paid fair, you've been reliable, and you've never once asked me to do anything I'd be embarrassed to tell my wife about. Whitmore's contract would pay me more." He shrugged. "But I'd have to live with the reason I took it." She reached across the table and put her hand briefly on his arm. She didn't say anything because sometimes words shrank the thing they were trying to describe. "There's something else," he said. She looked at him. "He's been talking to other freight men too," Calloway said. "Not just me. Jenkins over in Farrell Creek and the Bauer brothers out of the South Route. He's trying to cut off every road out of Willow Creek to Denver. He paused. Eleanor, he's not trying to slow you down anymore. He's trying to stop you completely before that hotel meeting. She drove home in the first gray of dawn and sat at her kitchen table and thought harder than she had thought about anything since she'd stood in a ruined orchard holding a bruised peach and tried to see what it still was. Whitmore knew about Holloway. He knew about Thursday, which meant he had someone watching her more closely than she'd realized. He was moving not just to inconvenience her, but to destroy the thing before it could get large enough to be beyond his reach. She had the Thursday meeting, but no guaranteed way to move product to Denver afterward. The Holloway arrangement was useless without freight. She needed a solution she hadn't thought of yet. She made herself sit still and think through every person, every resource, every connection she had built in the last 5 months. She made herself look at all of it without deciding in advance what would and wouldn't work. And then, around 6 in the morning, when the kitchen was starting to fill with the early light, she thought of something. She went to wake Samuel. He was already awake, sitting on the edge of his bed with his boots half on, because he'd heard her come home early and he'd known something was wrong. "I need to ask you something," she said from the doorway, "and I need you to think carefully before you answer." He finished putting on his boot. "All right. Ernesto Reyes," she said. "His father's farm. Does Miguel have a wagon?" "A good one," Samuel thought. "2. He uses one for the orchards and one for general hauling. The hauling wagon's solid, I've seen it. Big enough for a full load." "Does Ernesto know the Denver road?" "He's made that run with his father twice this season," Samuel said. He looked at her steadily. "You want to run your own freight?" "I want to stop being dependent on someone else to move what I make," she said. "Yes. You'd need Miguel's permission to use his wagon. I'd pay for it. And you'd need Ernesto to drive it unless you're planning to drive to Denver yourself." She had briefly considered driving to Denver herself. It was a 3-day round trip. "I'm considering it," she said. "You'd miss the Thursday meeting," he said immediately. She had already worked this out. "I wouldn't be going to Denver until after Thursday. I need the meeting first, but if Holloway says yes, I need to be able to tell him I have reliable freight arranged. I need that answer before Thursday morning." Samuel stood up. "Let me go talk to Ernesto," he said. "Samuel, it's 6 in the morning. Ernesto's been in the orchard since 5, he said. He's always in the orchard." She looked at the boy who had first come to her with muddy boots and careful eyes and no particular reason to trust the world, and she thought about how far they had both come since that afternoon in the mud. "Be back by 8, she said. He was back by 7:30. Ernesto would drive. Miguel would lend the wagon for a fair weekly rate. They could be ready to make the first Denver run within the week if needed. Eleanor sat with this information for exactly long enough to verify it made sense. Then she went to work. Thursday came faster than she expected, the way time moves when every day is full from edge to edge with work that matters. She had barely slept the night before, not from anxiety exactly, but from the particular aliveness of standing at the edge of something significant, the feeling of the ground changing under your feet. Robert Holloway arrived at 8 precisely, which told her something about him she already respected. She had set up the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and a jar of the preserves and 2 clean spoons, because she had learned that people who tasted the product made better business decisions than people who only heard about it. He tasted it before they discussed terms. He set the spoon down and looked at the jar for a moment. "You made this from hail-damaged fruit," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's not possible. The flavor in this damaged fruit doesn't produce flavor like this." "Damaged fruit that's handled correctly does," she said. "You have to know what you're looking for." He looked at her. "Mrs. Whitaker, I've been in the food supply business for 20 years. I have tasted a great many things. This is the best fruit preserve I've ever had. I want to be very direct with you about that." "I appreciate the directness," she said. "What kind of arrangement are you proposing?" They talked for 2 hours. He wanted exclusivity for the premium hotel market. She was willing to give him that category, but not general exclusivity. She would retain the right to sell to Margaret Dole, and to individual buyers, and to the local market without restriction. He pushed back on this once. She held the position quietly and without apology, and he looked at her and moved on. He wanted a minimum commitment of 300 jars per month, delivered reliably on a fixed schedule. She told him she could do that, and then she told him about Ernesto and the Reyes wagon and the freight arrangement. Not because she owed him a full accounting of her logistics, but because a buyer who understood your supply chain trusted you more, and trust was worth more than the appearance of smooth effortlessness. He seemed to appreciate the candor. They settled on a price that was higher than anything she had previously arranged. Not enormously higher. Enough. Enough to expand the kitchen. Enough to hire a fourth worker. Enough to pay Miguel Reyes for the wagon at a rate that made the arrangement fair on both sides. Enough to pay Samuel a real wage for the rest of the season and into winter. She wrote the agreed terms in her ledger while he watched. "I'll have a formal contract drawn," he said. "I can have it here by the end of next week." "I'll expect it," she said. He stood and put on his hat. "One more question," he said. "Personal curiosity. You don't have to answer." "Go ahead," she said. "Why peaches of everything you could have made from what you had? Why preserves?" She thought about this honestly. "Because my mother made preserves," she said, "and because preservation is about faith. You put something in a jar, and you seal it up, and you trust that when you open it again, the best of what it was will still be there." She paused. "I suppose I've always found that idea hopeful." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Mrs. Whitaker, I think you are a remarkable woman." He left. She sat at her kitchen table for a while after he was gone. Then Samuel came in from the yard where he'd been strategically invisible during the meeting and looked at her face. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. He sat down across from her and put his elbows on the table and covered his face with his hands for a moment in the way of someone who has been holding a great deal of tension and has just been permitted to put it down. 300 jars a month, she said. His hands came down. Every month. On contract. He sat up straight. "We're going to need more jars." "We're going to need a great many things," she said. "Make a list." He already had the paper out. She watched him write and felt the warmth of this ordinary moment. The boy at her table with his careful handwriting making a list of the things they needed to build what they were building, and understood that this too was what her mother had meant. Not just the fruit, not just the product. The life that grew up around the work. The people. The mornings and the evenings and the quiet hours of effort. The preservation of something good. What happened next, no one in Willow Creek could have predicted. It started with a letter. Not a letter to Eleanor. A letter to the territorial office in Denver, written by a man named Howard Breen, who had been a warehouse clerk for the Willow Creek Merchant Cooperative for 11 years, before Whitmore's restructuring of the cooperative had cost him his position along with his pension and his savings. Breen had moved to a small town 40 miles west and had been quiet for 2 years. But he had kept his records. The kind of records a careful man keeps when he suspects the day might come when they'd matter. The letter detailed with dates and figures a pattern of commercial fraud that Whitmore had been operating through the cooperative for the better part of a decade. Prices manipulated on both ends, buying at suppressed rates, and selling at inflated ones, with the differential passing through a set of accounts that existed in name only. Small amounts from many farmers across many seasons, which added up to a very large amount across 10 years. The territorial office sent a man. The man arrived in Willow Creek on a Wednesday morning, unremarkable looking, stayed at the boarding house, asked quiet questions around town. He visited Gerald Pierce at the bank. He visited 3 farm families that Breen's letter had specifically named. He was in town for 4 days before anyone understood what his visit meant. Eleanor heard about it from Anna, who heard about it from the boarding house keeper, who had overheard a conversation that she shouldn't have, but did. "A territorial investigator," Anna said. Eleanor held very still. "About what?" "The cooperative," Anna said. "About the prices Whitmore has been paying and what the market actually supported. About accounts that don't match what they should match." Eleanor thought about Tom Harmon's face when he described the 50 cents per crate. She thought about Miguel Reyes selling grade A fruit for below the cost of picking it. She thought about every farmer in this valley who had taken what Whitmore offered because they thought there was no other number. There had always been another number. Whitmore had simply made sure they never found out what it was. Breen, Eleanor said slowly. Howard Breen, the old cooperative clerk. You know him, Anna said. I know his name, Eleanor said. James mentioned him once years ago, said he was the most honest man at the cooperative and that Whitmore couldn't stand him for it. They looked at each other. He kept records, Eleanor said. Apparently, Anna said. The day the territorial investigator paid a visit to Charles Whitmore's office was not a quiet day in Willow Creek. Word moved through the town the way wildfire moves, fast and consuming and impossible to outpace. People gathered in small groups on the street and spoke in low voices, and the low voices carried the same note of astonishment mixed with something else, something that sounded almost like the release of pressure that had been building for a very long time. Eleanor did not go to watch. She stayed at the farmhouse and worked, because work was what she had and what she trusted, and because the outcome of whatever was happening in Whitmore's office was not in her hands and never had been. Samuel came home in the afternoon with the news. Whitmore had been asked to appear at the territorial office in Denver the following week regarding the cooperative accounts. His lawyer, not Calder, but his regular Denver lawyer, had been seen arriving by afternoon stage. The two men who had filed a complaint there were two, not just Breen, but a second farmer, whose name Samuel hadn't caught, had both given statements to the investigator. He's not arrested, Samuel said carefully. Not yet. But he's been found, Eleanor said. Yes, Samuel said, he's been found. She thought about what it meant. Not just for her, though she'd be dishonest to pretend her own situation wasn't part of what she was feeling, but for Tom Harmon, who had sold his best fruit for 50 cents a crate because he believed that was all it was worth. For Miguel Reyes, who had been systematically underpaid for a decade. For every family in this valley who had scratched out the same difficult season over and over and never understood that the difficulty had been artificially maintained. She thought about the peach in the mud, about what it looked like from the outside and what it actually was. The same was true of this valley. Underneath the appearance of a natural market, a fair exchange, a reasonable price, there had been something rotten. Something Whitmore had tended carefully for years. And it had taken a widow buying damaged fruit, and a fired clerk keeping his records, and a 12-year-old boy with careful eyes, and a 71-year-old immigrant woman with $45 and a conscience finally finding its direction to shake it loose. None of them had set out to expose Charles Whitmore. They had set out to build something honest. But honest things built in an environment shaped by dishonesty had a way of exposing it simply by existing. You didn't have to attack the fraud. You just had to demonstrate what fairness looked like. The contrast did the rest. The week after the investigator's visit, something shifted in Willow Creek. The shift wasn't dramatic. It didn't happen all at once. It was the accumulation of small things the way a season changes, not in a single day, but in the quality of the air and the angle of the light and the behavior of people who have understood something they didn't understand before. Tom Harmon stopped Eleanor at Market and said not about Whitmore exactly, but in a way that was clearly about Whitmore. I've been doing some asking around, about prices, about what my fruit is worth elsewhere. He paused. Turns out I've been underpaid by about 40% for the last 6 years. I know, she said gently. He nodded. His jaw was tight. I want to make sure I'm selling to the right people going forward. Come see me, she said. We'll work something out. Miguel Reyes did not say anything to Eleanor directly, but Ernesto told Samuel that his father had spoken to the territorial investigator and given a full account of every year's pricing going back to when he first started selling to the cooperative, because he had kept his own records too. Not because he'd expected it to matter, because a man who kept careful records of the harvest kept careful records of everything, and Miguel Reyes was that kind of man. Mrs. Hanford took down the last remnants of the wholesale arrangement proposal that Whitmore's man had brought in and put a larger display of golden storm jars in the window. And when Eleanor mentioned she'd noticed, Mrs. Hanford said briskly, "I should have done it sooner. I was foolish." "You were cautious," Eleanor said. "There's a difference." "Not much of one in the end," Mrs. Hanford said, but she smiled while she said it. Gerald Pierce at the bank made a point of catching Eleanor on the street one afternoon and saying somewhat formally, as if he'd rehearsed it, "Mrs. Whitaker, I want to say that the credit line you were approved for was approved on the merits of your business, and nothing that may have been communicated to me by other parties had any influence on that decision." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "Thank you, Gerald," she said. It was not entirely true, but it was what he needed to say, and she understood the difference between what was true and what people needed to say in order to move forward, and she was not the kind of person who demanded perfect honesty from everyone as the price of proceeding. Progress needed room for people to become better than they'd been. What happened with Whitmore in Denver took longer to resolve than anyone in Willow Creek had the patience for. Territorial proceedings moved at their own rate, which was slow and procedural and unsatisfying to people who wanted a clean, fast ending. He was not immediately arrested. He was not publicly humiliated in a single dramatic moment. What happened was slower and more thorough than that, a process of documentation and accounting and legal determination that dismantled what he had built the way you dismantle any structure built on a false foundation, carefully piece by piece finding what was real underneath. He did not return to Willow Creek after his Denver appearance. He sold the warehouse through his lawyer. He settled a number of the cooperative's outstanding accounts. He did not, to anyone's knowledge, go to prison, which was the thing that felt most unjust to the people he'd taken from over the years. But he lost everything that had made him powerful in Willow Creek. The relationships built on obligation, the dependency he'd manufactured, the ability to set the price of everything because everyone believed he was the only buyer. He lost the town. That was what Eleanor thought when she heard he wasn't coming back. Not that justice had been fully served, because she had learned enough about the world by now to know that it rarely was not in the clean and satisfying way stories sometimes pretended. But that the thing he had built on dishonesty, the empire of suppressed prices and manufactured helplessness, that thing was gone. And what was replacing it was hers. Not only hers, that was important. She had never wanted an empire of her own, had never wanted to be the person everyone depended on to the exclusion of all other options, because she knew what that looked like and what it did to people. What she wanted was something more modest and more durable. Fair prices, reliable relationships, a business that grew with the people around it, rather than at their expense. That winter, Eleanor expanded the kitchen. She hired 2 more workers. One of them a young widow from the south end of town named Clara, who had 3 children and needed regular work, and turned out to have a precise, focused temperament perfectly suited to the repetitive care of preservation work. She worked out a long-term supply arrangement with Miguel Reyes that paid him what his fruit was worth and gave him advanced knowledge of her needs so he could plan his plantings accordingly. When she told him the new per-crate price, he looked at her for a long moment and then said simply, "Thank you." "It's what it's worth," she said. "I know," he said, "but I wasn't always sure anyone else did." The Halloway contract produced its first full delivery run in November. Ernesto on the wagon with a load of 280 jars carefully packed and wrapped. He came back with a bank draft and a note from Robert Halloway, saying the hotel kitchen manager was extremely pleased and asking whether Eleanor could add any additional varieties to the next shipment. She was already thinking about plum. Anna came to dinner every Sunday that winter, arriving at the farmhouse with something from her kitchen and staying until the evening talking with Eleanor and Samuel across the cleared table about everything and nothing, the way people talk when they have earned the right to sit still together. Samuel turned 13 in December. Eleanor baked a cake, which was not something she'd done in years, and she put it on the table, and he looked at it and looked at her and said, "You didn't have to do that." And she said, "I know." And they ate it in the company of Anna and Clara and Ernesto, who had been invited because he was practically family by now, and it was the best cake she'd ever made, not because of the recipe, but because of who was eating it. She thought about James sometimes. Not with the hollow grief of the first year when thinking about him was like pressing on a wound, with something steadier. With the understanding that the life she was living now was not a consolation for the life she'd lost, but something she'd built from what the loss had left her from the farmhouse, and the stubbornness and the knowledge of how things were made, and the refusal to accept that damaged meant finished. She thought James would have liked Samuel. She thought he would have been amazed at what she'd done. She thought he would have said, "Eleanor, I always knew you had this in you," and she would have said, "You might have mentioned it sooner," and they would have laughed. The first day of spring came with mud and birdsong, and the smell of ground softening after a long freeze, and Eleanor stood on the porch in the early morning with her coffee and looked out at the valley coming back to itself. The farmhouse was not the same one she'd been living in alone 2 years ago, silent and heavy and reduced. The kitchen had doubled in size. There were 2 additional sheds for storage, a proper loading area where Ernesto could pull the wagon right up to the door. The shelves inside held rows of labeled jars that would go to Denver by the end of the week, and orders for the spring season were already written into the ledger on the kitchen table. Samuel came out and stood beside her with his own coffee, which he'd started drinking in the way of someone who had decided that since he worked like an adult, he was going to have an adult's coffee. He was taller than he'd been in October. She'd noticed that. He was going to be a tall man, and she thought he was going to be a very good one. "Spring," he said. "Yes," she said. "New peach season in about 2 months," he said. "Assuming no hailstorm." "Assuming," she said. "And if there is one—" He looked at her. There was something in his expression that was so exactly like the careful, assured look he'd had in the orchard, the boy offering to help load crates for the woman everyone called a fool, that it made her chest ache with something very close to love. "Then we buy the damaged ones," he said. She looked out at the valley. "Yes," she said, "we do." There is a thing that happens in a life sometimes more than once, but not often, where you look around at where you are and understand fully and without qualification that you have become exactly who you were supposed to be. Not the person the world tried to make you, not the person shaped by what others decided you were worth, but the person built by your own choices, your own work, your own understanding of what was good inside something that everyone else had thrown away. Eleanor Whitaker had been a widow in a farmhouse with $3 and a pile of ruined fruit. She had been the woman the town laughed at, the woman the powerful man tried to crush, the woman too big and too stubborn and too slow to know she was supposed to give up. She was still all of those things. She was also the woman who had built something real. She had built it from damage, from the fruit nobody wanted, and the grief nobody helped her carry, and the long nights at the stove, and the endless mornings getting back up. She had built it with the help of a woman who found her courage late, and a man who chose loyalty over security, and a boy who showed up every day because she had shown him what it looked like to show up. She had built it by understanding the most important thing her mother had ever taught her. The value of a thing is not decided by the person who wants to pay you the least for it. You decide the value by what you make, by what you refuse to let go of, by what you pick up from the mud when everyone else walks away, by what you see when you hold the damaged thing to the light and look past the bruise to the sweetness underneath. Golden Storm Preserves went on to supply 15 hotels across Colorado and Wyoming within 3 years. The label, which Eleanor designed herself, showed a single peach against a stormy sky. People who knew the story said it was perfect. People who didn't know the story just said it was beautiful. Both were true. Samuel Carter managed the business operations by the time he was 17. He was precise, loyal, and completely unwilling to let anyone undervalue what they made, a quality Eleanor had never once tried to teach him, because he had come to it on his own. Anna Kowalski ate Sunday dinner at Eleanor's table until she was 84 years old, at which point she said she had done enough eating and enough living and was ready to rest, and she went to sleep one January night and did not wake up, which was so close to what she would have chosen for herself that Eleanor found she could not be entirely sad about it. Miguel Reyes and his family became the primary fruit supplier for Golden Storm for as long as they chose to farm, which was a very long time. And Eleanor Whitaker herself, the woman who had been too heavy and too quiet and too stubborn to accept what the world offered her, became exactly the kind of person she had always been, without apology and without performance and without the slightest interest in anyone's permission. A woman who picked up what others discarded and showed them what it was worth. A woman who looked at the bruised and the broken and the thrown away and saw not an ending, but a beginning. A woman who understood bone deep and permanent that the storm doesn't get to decide what survives it. You do.